A CEO built an empire on discipline and grit, until a single mother's silent struggle forced him to rewrite every rule. What happened next changed hundreds of lives overnight. Jonathan Price believed in one thing, and one thing only. Hard work was the only path to success. He wasn't born into wealth. He had no one paving the way for him. Everything he built, Price Freight Systems, now a leading logistics empire, began with an old pickup truck and sleepless nights. At 42, Jonathan sat behind a large glass desk on the 18th floor of his Atlanta office, staring out at the city skyline. Each building, each stream of traffic below was proof of the principle he lived by. Work hard, and the rewards will come. Fairness means being paid exactly what your effort is worth. Nothing more, nothing less. To his employees, Jonathan wasn't the warm, fuzzy boss type. He didn't celebrate birthdays. He didn't ask about families. Not because he lacked empathy, but because he believed the workplace was for work, not personal stories. He paid above industry average, never missed a payroll, and had zero tolerance for sloppiness. If someone worked hard, they'd be rewarded. If they didn't, they were let go. It was that simple, like running a machine. The cold office hummed with the ticking of the wall clock, blending into the soft clacking of keys as Jonathan reviewed the quarterly report. Out in the hallway, most lights were already off. A few custodians were tidying up, the whir of a vacuum echoing through the empty corridors. But at the end of the hallway, a dim light still glowed from the break room, something that caught his eye. He glanced at it, then back at his screen, ready to ignore it. But something small, almost imperceptible, held him back. Something was off. In Jonathan's world, everything had order. People came in, worked, got paid, went home. No one owed anyone anything. And no one needed to know how someone lived after hours. That was the golden rule, the rule that built his empire. Except tonight, something small was about to chip away at that rule. Jonathan's eyes drifted from the screen again, this time catching a flicker of movement at the end of the hall. Through the glass wall, the faint light inside the break room was still on. 9:47 p.m., well past closing time. He started to turn back to his spreadsheet, but paused. Danielle Miller. He recognized her instantly. 29 warehouse operations with Price Freight for over 4 years. Never late, never complained. The kind of employee any executive would dream of. Quiet, efficient, and never asked for a thing. Jonathan squinted. Danielle stood near the break room small food counter, where the microwave, coffee machine, and leftover snacks from the afternoon meeting were kept. The cafeteria had closed at 6 p.m. No one was supposed to be in there. She looked nervous. She rose on her toes, whispering something to the kitchen staff member on duty, an older man Jonathan couldn't recall the name of. Their exchange was brief. The man hesitated, glanced around, then bent down behind the counter. A moment later, he handed her a plastic takeout container, the kind usually reserved for leftovers. Danielle nodded, clutching the box like it was something precious, and quickly slipped it into a worn-out canvas tote bag. She glanced quickly around, her eyes catching the ceiling camera, then walked briskly toward the door. Her stride didn't reek of guilt, but of fear. The kind of fear that comes from doing something you're not supposed to, even if it's just asking for leftover food. Jonathan sat still. He didn't say anything. He didn't stop her. But the image clung to him like a fine layer of dust that wouldn't brush off. Why would someone like Danielle, someone who worked hard, need to ask for food? She was a full-time employee, paid according to the standards he had set. No one had ever complained about Price Freight's wages. So why had she resorted to sneaking food, like she'd broken a rule? Something stirred inside Jonathan, an emotion he couldn't quite name. It wasn't anger. It wasn't pity. It was something tight, something suffocating. And right then, in that cold office deep into the night, he realized something he had never allowed himself to consider. Maybe the fairness he'd always believed in had never been enough. Jonathan had never done anything like this before. But that night, instead of driving straight to his upscale midtown apartment, he walked slowly to the parking lot, keeping a quiet distance as he spotted Danielle crossing the dark street toward the bus stop. She sat near the window, hunched in a worn coat. No phone, no headphones. Just a vacant stare through the foggy glass, as if she'd grown used to this weary commute. Jonathan sat toward the back of the bus, silently watching, careful not to feel like a voyeur. The bus rolled away from the city's gleaming towers, heading deeper into older neighborhoods. Streetlights flickered, sidewalks cracked, storefronts dark and sagging under broken signs. Jonathan began to realize this was a part of Atlanta he had never stepped into. When Danielle got off, he followed. She moved quickly past a rusted fence and up the stairs of a crumbling apartment complex, its steps chipped and uneven. No one noticed her. No one greeted her home. Jonathan stopped a short distance away, hiding behind a streetlight pole. Through a worn, yellowing curtain, he could see inside. The apartment was nearly empty. No sofa, no dining table. Just a thin mattress pushed into a corner and a few folded blankets stored in plastic bins. 2 kids, a boy and a girl, maybe 5 or 6 years old, ran up to her when she walked in. Danielle crouched down, her tired smile faint but real. She pulled out the food container, carefully dividing the portions onto 2 small plastic plates. For herself, she didn't eat. She simply sat, watched, and gently rubbed her son's back as he ate too quickly, driven by hunger. Jonathan felt something inside him crumble. He had believed that working hard was enough to live. He had thought the wages he paid were fair. But now, right in front of him, was living proof that he had been wrong. Danielle wasn't just working to live. She was fighting to survive. And suddenly, all the principles that had shaped his life fell disturbingly, painfully silent. Jonathan couldn't sleep that night. The image of that dinner, divided 3 ways, children eating in haste, a bare room with a mattress on the floor, kept looping in his mind. The next morning, he requested the payroll records. Employee ID, number 54721, Danielle Miller. For years working at the West Side warehouse. Work history, not a single unexcused absence, always willing to take on any open shift. Once even worked 21 days straight. Last month's earnings, $4,960. By Atlanta's standards, that wasn't a small amount. In fact, it was considerably higher than most blue-collar jobs in the same industry. So why were a mother and her 2 kids living in conditions worse than he ever imagined? Jonathan sat silently in front of his computer, then pulled up the detailed HR file. And finally he understood. Danielle was a single mother. Her ex-husband, according to the insurance file, died 2 years ago in a workplace accident. No life insurance, no inheritance. Just her and 2 kids, alone. Rent for that tiny apartment ate up nearly half her paycheck. Add on flexible hour babysitting for overnight shifts. Rates almost double the norm due to inconsistent hours. Utility bills, asthma medication for her daughter, and lingering medical debt from last year. After all expenses were factored in, the spreadsheet displayed a cold, emotionless number, $147, left at the end of each month. No savings, no emergency fund, no extended child health care coverage, no room for error, just exhaustion, disguised as professionalism. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, something inside him quietly collapsing. For the first time, he saw it clearly. People aren't poor because they don't work hard. Some people work so hard, they have no time left to live. And suddenly, the philosophy he built his empire on, those who do more get more, sounded less like a truth and more like a cruel taunt. From that night forward, Jonathan Price never saw his employees the same way again. The next morning, he walked the halls of Price Freight Systems in his usual tailored suit, with the same steely gaze that normally silenced the entire floor. But this time, that gaze wasn't just measuring productivity. It quietly scanned the things he'd never bothered to notice before. The shadows under tired eyes. A battered thermos carried from home. An accountant whispering to her toddler over the phone while reviewing balance sheets. These were sights he once dismissed as part of the job. But now, they made something twist inside his chest. I was looking, Jonathan thought, but I never really saw. For 20 years, Jonathan Price had built Price Freight Systems from the ground up, clinging to one absolute principle. Hard work always pays off. He never mistreated his employees. On the contrary, he paid well, gave full holiday bonuses, and calculated overtime by the hour, never forcing anyone. To him, that was fairness. But whose fairness? He had never once worried whether his child's dinner had enough nutrients. Never had to choose between paying for medicine or rent. Never feared losing childcare because of a last-minute shift. So then this fairness he believed in, was it ever really fair? Just as he was still lost in thought, Cheryl Dawson, his longtime CFO and right hand, knocked gently on the office door. "You okay?" she asked, eyes narrowing at the unfamiliar look on her boss's face. Jonathan looked up, paused for a moment, then replied slowly, "Cheryl, I built this entire company on a belief. But last night, I realized I might have been wrong." Cheryl raised an eyebrow. Wrong about what? He silently turned his monitor toward her, displaying the income and expense breakdown of Danielle Miller. Cheryl scanned the screen, her grip on the folder in her hands tightening. "I always believed if you work hard, you'll make a living. But no, for some people, hard work is just survival," Jonathan said quietly, eyes heavy with thought. "And maybe we need to change something, Cheryl." She didn't answer right away, but for the first time, she felt it in her gut. Maybe Price Freight Systems was about to rewrite the way a company treats its people. That afternoon on the 19th floor, home to the executive offices of Price Freight Systems, a small figure stepped inside, slightly out of place among the sleek glass and steel. Danielle Miller wore a fraying collared shirt, her hair neatly tied back, soft-soled shoes making hesitant steps. She was escorted by the receptionist to the CEO's office. The door opened, and Jonathan Price was already standing, waiting. "Thank you for coming, Danielle," he said, his tone gentler than usual. Danielle nodded faintly, still clutching the strap of her tote bag, like it was the last piece of courage she had. The room fell into a strange, almost sacred silence. Jonathan gestured for her to sit, then took the seat across from her, fingers interlaced on the desk. "You're probably wondering why I asked you here." He began. "I saw you yesterday." Danielle froze, her eyes widening slightly. But she didn't flinch, just bowed her head, her face relaxing into a look of quiet fatigue and resignation. "You mean in the cafeteria?" she asked softly. Jonathan shook his head slowly. "Not just there. I followed you home." A long silence froze between them for several seconds. Danielle looked up, her eyes a mix of surprise and guarded tension. "You followed me?" She didn't raise her voice, but every word carried weight. "Not to judge," he replied quickly, "to understand." Jonathan leaned forward, his eyes holding a rare sincerity. "I saw you divide a single meal between two children. An apartment with nothing. No bed, no table, no chairs. Just a thin mattress on the floor." Danielle swallowed hard, her lips trembling slightly, but she said nothing. "Danielle," he continued, "I've always considered myself a fair man. I believed that if you worked hard, you'd be okay. But last night, you made me realize I was wrong." She looked at him, eyes beginning to redden. "I didn't come here to ask for anything," she whispered. "I just do the best I can. That's all I have." Jonathan nodded gently. "And that is what changed me." He opened a drawer and pulled out a thick envelope, though he didn't slide it across the table. "I didn't call you in here to hand you money. I called you here to ask, would you help me change this entire system? Not just for you, but for everyone like you." Danielle held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded softly. "I don't know how much I can help, but if you're serious about changing things, I won't back down." And in that moment, inside one of the most powerful offices in the city, a quiet conversation planted the seed for something much greater. The next morning, Jonathan Price arrived at the office earlier than usual. The Atlanta skyline was still shrouded in morning mist, but his mind was burning with ideas. Not numbers or revenue projections, but the image of a mother and her two kids in a bare apartment, and Danielle's voice echoing in his head. "I just do the best I can. That's all I have." He couldn't ignore it. Jonathan picked up the internal phone. "Have Cheryl Dawson come see me as soon as she arrives." 10 minutes later, Cheryl, the CFO of Price Freight Systems, walked in, coffee cup in hand, her eyes still heavy with sleep. "You called this early. What's going on, Jonathan? Jonathan motioned for her to sit, then opened his laptop. I need to restructure our entire employee policy. Specifically, higher wages, childcare support, an emergency relief fund, and a long-term skills development program. Cheryl nearly spilled her coffee. Wait, are you saying all of it? Jonathan, you're talking about a full-scale policy overhaul. Jonathan nodded, eyes bright with conviction. Not to be charitable. To be right. I've seen the truth, Cheryl. Everything we're doing, performance bonuses, internal competition, keeps the high performers. But the ones who quietly carry the weight, raise kids alone, work triple shifts, we've been leaving them behind. Cheryl sighed and opened her iPad. Raising wages company-wide, we'll need to run projections. Are we talking family benefits too? Child health care support? Or just targeted aid for the lowest income tier? No, Jonathan said firmly. There is no lowest income tier. We do this for everyone. Every employee deserves the right to live with dignity. Cheryl looked at him for a long time. This won't be easy. The board will ask why. Investors will ask about returns. And if it all goes sideways, I'll take full personal responsibility, Jonathan interrupted, eyes unwavering. If I have to, I'll cut my own salary. Cheryl sat in silence for a moment, then let out a quiet laugh. I've never seen you like this. That's because I've never looked this closely before. She nodded, slow but resolute. All right, then let's start with the numbers. Jonathan stood and walked toward the glass wall, looking down at the line of freight trucks pulling out of the depot. He knew this time he wasn't just running a company. He was igniting a quiet revolution. That morning, in the boardroom on the 21st floor of Price Freight Systems, the air felt dense, as if the entire room was holding its breath. Sunlight streamed through the glass walls, casting long shadows across the walnut table where Jonathan Price sat across from a row of skeptical stares. Executive team members, major investors, financial attorneys, all present. On the big screen, a slide detailed a new reform plan, baseline wage increases, child care support, emergency aid fund, and internal development training. Greg Whitman, longtime shareholder, crossed his arms and leaned forward, breaking the silence. Jonathan, I'll be blunt. These numbers will hit our quarterly profits. Hard. Are you planning to go against the entire market? Another voice chimed in. We already pay fair wages. If someone can't survive on that, maybe they're in the wrong line of work. Jonathan clenched his hands, eyes still on the screen, but his voice steady. Just because something is reasonable doesn't mean it's right. I didn't build this company to end up hearing a child ask their mother if they're allowed to eat breakfast. A wave of murmurs swept through the room. Cheryl Dawson, the CFO, remained calm, but subtly leaned in toward Jonathan, as if bracing to defend him. Then suddenly, the boardroom door swung open. A young woman stepped inside. It was Danielle Miller. She wore the same faded blouse, her face pale with worry, but her eyes steady with resolve. One advisor jumped to his feet. Who let you in here? Jonathan raised his hand. I did. The room fell silent. Danielle walked forward, opened a worn brown envelope, and placed its contents on the table. Inside was a child's sketch in pencil, crude and heartfelt. A little girl had drawn herself, her younger brother, their mom, and a meal split in two. At the bottom, 3 words. Thank you, Mom. She looked up, voice soft but unwavering. I'm not asking for pity. I just do my best every day. But sometimes, doing your best still is enough. Jonathan rose to his feet. His tone was no longer gentle. That's exactly why I'm doing this. And if any of you can't see that, then walk away from the company I built. A heavy silence swept the room. Cheryl let out a quiet laugh. Her first all morning. I think we all just found out who the real leader is. The room stayed still after Jonathan's bold declaration. Some glanced down at their paperwork. Others shifted in their chairs, unsure. Most simply watched, waiting to see how far he was willing to go. He stood tall, removed his glasses, and set them on the table. If this plan doesn't work, he said, voice steady, I will be the first to take the fall. Not our shareholders. Not our staff. Me. Greg Whitman raised a brow. What exactly are you saying, Jonathan? I'll cut my executive salary by 80%. Jonathan replied without hesitation. Every dollar of that will go into the emergency assistance fund. And if this plan doesn't meet expectations after a year, I'll eliminate my entire personal bonus, including dividends. The room held its breath. Cheryl Dawson turned to him, surprise and admiration flickering in her eyes. He was placing both his reputation and personal fortune on the line. We're talking about millions of dollars, a shareholder muttered, stunned. No, Jonathan said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. We're talking about millions of hours of unseen labor, millions of sleepless nights for people like Danielle, and kids who've never had a decent breakfast. And if you still think this change is a financial risk, then I'll carry that risk myself. This time, it was Margaret Ellison, one of the oldest and most skeptical shareholders, who broke the silence. She set down her pen and spoke. I used to think you were cold, Jonathan, but today I see something rare in a leader, true accountability. She turned to Cheryl. I approve. Let's move forward with the plan. A nod followed, then another. Finally, Greg, his eyes still locked on Jonathan, let out a long breath. If you're putting your salary on the line, then I won't sit this out either. He raised his hand slowly but firmly. I'm in. Jonathan clenched his hand into a quiet fist, but his gaze remained calm. The battle had only just begun, but he knew. This time, he wasn't fighting for numbers. He was fighting for people. And for the first time, it felt absolutely right. A week after the historic board meeting, something had shifted at Price Freight headquarters in Atlanta. No one said it outright, but everyone could feel it. The news of the new policy had spread like an underground current. Base wage increases, child care support, emergency aid programs, and most notably, an internal scholarship fund for employees wanting to pursue trade school or college. It all started with a vote few believed would pass. The results weren't unanimous, but they were enough to push the initiative forward. Jonathan knew parts of the leadership team still resisted it behind closed doors, but he also knew this. Real change didn't need full agreement, just enough courage to begin. Cheryl Dawson, the woman who had helped him build the plan line by line, walked into his office holding a thick printed binder. We can begin phase 1 next month, she said, setting the file on his desk. I've worked with finance and legal. There will be pushback from some of the major shareholders, but none of them hold veto power at this stage. Jonathan nodded slowly. Good. I want our employees to know this is real, not a PR stunt, not a gimmick. Cheryl looked at him, her expression softening. You know, I used to think you were the kind of CEO who only cared about numbers. But since that day, I've started to think differently. Jonathan didn't answer right away. He turned to the window, watching a freight truck roll out of the yard, its wheels kicking up dust, the fading sunlight gleaming off its metal frame. All my life I believed hard work was enough, he said quietly. But no one should have to push themselves to exhaustion just to survive. Sometimes the fairest thing you can do is admit that some people have already given everything they've got, and it still isn't enough. And when that happens, you can't just stand there and watch. Cheryl smiled. So what about now? Do you think you've done the right thing? Jonathan turned the worn wedding ring on his finger, a keepsake from his late wife. He looked straight at Cheryl. I don't know yet, but for the first time in my life, I feel like I'm finally starting in the right place. That morning, the main lobby of Price Freight headquarters was packed. Over 200 employees had gathered. Truck drivers, office staff, security guards, admin assistants. All of them had received an urgent email from the CEO's office. Jonathan Price will speak at 9 a.m. Be there on time. No one knew exactly what was going on. Rumors of a major shift had been swirling to the hallway for 2 weeks, but no one expected this. The quiet, famously disciplined Nkodzo stepping into a crowd like this. No podium, no microphone, no barriers. Jonathan wore a simple white dress shirt, no blazer. No tie. He stood before them, eyes scanning the familiar faces. People who had built this company alongside him, who had carried its weight, often in silence. Good morning, he began, voice low and steady. I don't usually do this. But today is an ordinary day. The room fell into complete silence. For many years, I believed this. If you work hard, you'll earn what you deserve. I built this company on that belief. And I was partly right. He paused. But recently, I learned something more important. That hard work should not be the only road to survival. That fairness means nothing without compassion. And that if someone like Danielle Miller has to work 3 shifts and still can't feed her 2 children dinner, then the system needs a change. A few eyes began to well with tears. Starting next month, Jonathan continued, we're officially raising the base wage. We're establishing emergency assistance. We're launching internal scholarships. We're supporting childcare. And most importantly, we're going to start listening. The crowd erupted. No one had expected it to really happen. Not through email, not through HR, but straight from the voice of the man at the very top. As Jonathan's eyes scanned the crowd, he caught sight of Danielle standing near the stairwell, gripping the strap of her bag tightly. She didn't say a word, but she nodded just once. And in that moment, Jonathan knew he hadn't just helped one family. He had laid the first brick of a new culture, where justice walks hand in hand with humanity, where work isn't just about surviving, but about living with dignity.